Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Pay It Forward podcast with Payable and hosted by FF News. I'm Doug Mackenzie and today we're going to be learning some incredible payments facts with the Director General of the Payments Association, Tony Craddock. Tony, how are you doing? You good?
Doing really well, thank you, Doug. Good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for appearing. Now, Tony, I think we've got to look at the state of the industry, the payments industry, the fintech industry, and you're the perfect person to ask. Why has there been such a dramatic decline in electronic money institution authorizations? I mean, I seem to remember, very early on in the fintech scene, it was like the kind of gateway to being, a proper fintech. Has it been, just a kind of, has it stemmed from Brexit, or potentially have people been a bit naughty with their perceptions of what constitutes a fintech and if they can actually be a realistic EMI?
So it's a great question. The trend a few years ago was to be able to encourage the industry to offer new products and services to compete with banks, and that was done through smaller electronic money institutions, and so the government had to kind of open the doors to bringing those organizations in. What has subsequently happened is two things, I think. In the regulator has realized that actually perhaps a few people snuck in under the radar that perhaps shouldn't have done, and as a result they actually are concerned about the quality of EMI standards of products and services, and secondly that they want to raise the standard to ensure that the potential risks attached to failures of those organizations would be prevented. So the quality of the applications that were required rose, and at the same time, organizations were having to struggle to find the quality of submission necessary. So we see this as a kind of a trend that will not last forever. The good news is that we're getting very good quality EMIs coming through to being authorized. And this is all about getting the standards in the industry rising, and that's just the right thing we should be doing.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I mean, that is obviously the role of the regulators to kind of create that burden of professionalism, and it's exciting to see what we'll see out the fruits of that. Now, speaking of, that then leads us to, I think the UK has recently just celebrated, its 5th year anniversary of proper open banking. Now, despite obviously being one of the first countries to really embrace open banking, we're seeing in maybe some high growth markets like Brazil really taking kind of payments to a whole new level through open banking. Would you say it's fair to say that the UK is kind of falling a little bit behind, or is it just that countries like Brazil with less infrastructure already in place can just embrace it better?
I think this concept of being ahead or behind is quite an interesting one. The Brits, bizarrely, always like to be ahead. It's a sort of a competitive instinct we seem to have, and I don't know quite why that's necessary. I think in many of the other countries, it's just doing what's the best thing for their country. And when you look at each individual market around the world, the adoption of payments differs according to what's needed in the market. So what's needed in India, for example, in a country where a few years ago and until UPI came in, the whole digital identity and payment scheme came in, 95% of all transactions were done in cash. So when you look at the ability to identify who is in society and to tax them appropriately according to what's necessary, it's almost impossible when the whole ecosystem is run by cash. So you come up with a great, free, instantly deployed and universally deployed system, and it works very, very well. You've now got 1.2 billion people who are on that scheme. You go to Brazil, and then the requirement was slightly different. The government decided that actually they wanted to bring people into the financial system because being outside it prevented them from accessing many of the things in society, online shopping, convenient access to best prices of travel and other sorts of services. And so as a result, they came up with PIX. the circumstances in Brazil were not the same as India. Therefore, they did what was right for Brazil. What we've got to do is what's right for the UK. Now, we have developed open banking. I think some lessons learned over the last 5 years. And as Marion King, who's the old chair of the advisory board at the Payments Association, has said several times, there's a few things we would have done differently. And one of them is we would have come up with a commercial model that was going to incentivize investment. There's not enough reward in it for certain parties, and so just squeezing the banks to pay for everything is not a long-term solution. It just doesn't work. And there's another couple of things that are missing, which we're going to be investing in over the next few years. I think is a consumer protection setup and a dispute resolution setup. That means to say the consumers can have an equivalent level of confidence that should something go wrong, their money can be recovered, and that if there is a problem, that they can have a means of disputing it. So those are the things that I think need to be built. So, the government has pulled together the three main regulators under the Joint Regulatory Oversight Committee, as you know, and have done a good job, I think, of aligning that. I think it needs a bit of a rocket. Put up its but to kind of accelerate the pace a little bit. But I think that's certainly within the plans of the government's recent announcement that it will be having a payment strategy for the country, and this will, I hope, be included as one of the main features.
Yes, it's fascinating you bring this up, because just before we were set to rolling in the green room, we were talking about the huge changes that the UK government and the regulators here are doing in terms of fraud, for instance. And it seems to be, we were talking about the online safety bill. We're talking about how we're going to put liability to certain banks when it comes to APP fraud. So do you think that, to kind of follow on from your answer very briefly, the UK government and their regulators are doing fast enough to protect consumers in a post-Brexit economy?
No, they're not doing enough. But actually, it's up to the industry to do more. And we are doing a lot to invest in improving the quality of fraud prevention, because this whole idea of reimbursing people who have been scammed or have been defrauded of their money is all well and good. It's a good socially responsible thing to do. But what we really want to do is to prevent the fraudsters in the first place and catch them once they've been penalised and once they've been caught. So I think there's a couple of things needed here. I was really pleased to see announced today the third phase of the government's anti-fraud program, which is, you'll see on the TV over the coming weeks, examples of people being encouraged to be smart. I saw a wonderful email from Santander the other day, really explaining very clearly what you can and can't do, what you should and shouldn't do. And when people start chatting about it in the pub, then people will start being smart. We want people to be smart about preventing fraud in the first place. And our industry is investing hugely in the tools and techniques necessary to ensure that the fraudsters get spotted before they even get to the consumer. So I think there's a number of factors going on here. There are some other things that I think are potentially helpful, but are also very highly risky, which is, I believe that the PSR's policies to prevent authorized push payment fraud, which is, of course, the fraud between people who are moving money not via their cards, but via their bank account, from their own bank account to the fraudster, thinking that it is something that it isn't. They are bold policies. I think they are excluding the people who should be at the table, which is the main merchants, such as the e-commerce merchants, such as Meta, for example, and Facebook, who, according to one bank, are responsible for over 70% of their authorized push payment frauds.
It's almost quite a blessing, isn't it, that three of the large tech companies, we know that is where the majority of fraud is coming from. So now we know that. I think there could be more to be done with it. And like you said, the remedy is to bring them to the table.
So the difficulty the PSR has is that they don't regulate those organizations, and the government has encouraged them to come to the table, but all they've done so far is a voluntary code.
Yeah.
So and you can understand why they don't want to be at the table. It'd be very expensive for them to shoulder their proportion of the burden of fraud. I also think it's wrong that the payments industry should be having to shoulder 100% of the burden of any scams that are discovered. That doesn't, it is certainly going to motivate certain behaviors that are advantageous for consumers, and we will become better at identifying fraudsters and making sure that we share information centrally between our organizations, so we spot the bad ones and get them identified before they actually get involved with a scam. However, what they're not doing is they're not able to resolve all frauds, and it kind of seems odd that we are going to be penalized for almost all authorized push payment frauds that take place. And I think it'll have a significant and material impact on the industry, and not necessarily a good one.
It is quite punitive in the fact that, these organizations, the institutions, the financial institutions, have created this infrastructure to enable the consumer to have a better payments experience, and is now, with one hand, being, as I mentioned, slightly punished for it, whereas the big tech giants who don't have to play by the same rules but are still getting into the payments industry, since Apple, Meta, are kind of being held at a looser leash, which is very, very interesting. But
one of the things we're going to see from the PSR's policies, I think, is an industry that's going to be much more concerned about whether to authorize a financial transaction or not. I think we're going to move from an era of faster payments to an era of slower payments. So if there's a slightly out of the ordinary payment that you're trying to make, then your bank or your account provider, your EMI perhaps, will become increasingly cautious about whether to process that transaction. And consumers will have to become familiar that that's entirely the result of the fraud in the first place, and secondly, the retailers not spotting it in advance or enabling it in advance. So I think that's going to be difficult for consumers. It's a lower quality payments experience, but it's a consequence, I think, of the PSR's policies. And in a way, it is kind of sensible if you think that this is an abnormal transaction and you just want to be absolutely sure that it's to the right people for the right circumstances, and you've got the right authorizations, then well, let's just take there was a time when we waited 3 days for a transaction to clear and settle, and with a check. So why it should necessarily be done instantly is for conjecture.
That leads me on to kind of like seeing where we've kind of come as an industry, and as mentioned in that kind of pendulum swinging the other way, from innovation to preventing friction to potentially being a little bit more demure, a little more focused on protection. So you've seen the industry change so much. Famously, the Emerging Payments Association became the Payments Association. What made you think the time was right for that change?
So this was it was really, I know it sounds odd, but it really was because there was a seat at the table. There was a seat at the table that the community needed to have a representation sitting there. There were other organizations that had combined into one, and there was no organization that essentially was focused just on payments. And it is such an exciting, such a dynamic, such a changing, such a competitive, but such an innovative industry, that having a representative body seemed to make a lot of sense. So we were initially looking just at the more innovative and progressive organizations under the Emerging Payments Association, but there was a time just to drop the emerging, and it seemed to be a natural move. And do you know what? At the time, we were very concerned. We thought maybe people would think we're being a bit cheeky by sitting at that top table, but you know what? Actually, it's been fantastic. And I spent some time with the government last week. We presented it in Parliament on Wednesday, our payments manifesto, which is our doctrine for what we believe the industry should be in the future. Spending some time with the government also about what we're going to do with this national payment strategy. And you know what? We were there because they needed somebody to talk to, and we are with 210 or so members, and have been going for some time. We've got a great approach that I think is right for the time. A bit of good luck, basically, Doug, and a bit of cheek, and then a bit of good market common sense.
Well, congratulations on unveiling that strategy, and it's brilliant, and it really does showcase just how important your organization is to really kind of, get at the heart of both regulators, the innovators, and the government. So, now to wrap up, I think one thing that we've both kind of been talking about concurrently throughout this whole conversation is just how payments is leading the way in terms of being the most innovative vertical within finance, or at least certainly the most interesting. So I've got to ask your perspective, okay, and hopefully you can help some of our viewers here. How do you stay on top of the industry and trends?
So the truth is, you can't keep on top of everything. You've got to work out what is the critical information that you're going to need to help you to do your day-to-day job better, and just make sure you're plugged into the right sources. Interestingly enough, the challenge is not so much is the information out there, but how on earth do you access the stuff that you need? And so as a result, I generally get most of my insight not from reading things, much as I think that's useful, but from conversations. So we have a series of executive roundtable dinners that we run, and I love hosting those because I sit down. Last week I was with ConnexPay, and we did one of these on the travel sector. I learned a huge amount about travel and virtual cards and the volumes and everything. And then early last week I did a podcast with Gary Palmer, who's the CEO of Payall, and he's got a really fascinating approach to how to solve the problems of cross-border. So generally, Doug, it's by getting out and talking to people, and that's why I was so pleased. And can we talk a little bit about the national payments vision and strategy from the government, because to me that's the hot news. So I was really pleased to see that following a conversation that Jeremy Hunt had in India last summer, at which he discovered that it's possible to pay using a QR code. He said to his colleagues, how come we are able to pay with a QR code in India, but not in the UK? What's going on here? Are we falling behind? He then commissioned Joe Garner, who became the author of what's known as the Garner Report, but essentially the Future Payments Review, whichever, which is published in November. And what Joe did is he went out and talked to people. Yeah. I'm sure he read all your stuff and lots of reports, but he went out and talked to people, and he said, what's the nuances of here? What's the direction of travel? What are the priorities? What are the problems? What are the challenges? And he used the sort of, human beings are wonderful. When they're faced with these complexities, they resolve them by coming up with answers. And his big answer, which and a few people were cynical about, but I think is absolutely right, is that the government needs to show some leadership.
Yeah.
And they're showing leadership through the Treasury, who are producing the national payments vision. And they will be publishing this, they maintain, in the summer. I hope it will be at the Mansion House speech, which will be a year on from the announcement of the review in the first place. We are contributing significantly to this. I would love to have some of our input reflected in the final strategy. But the truth is that was derived from conversations. So in answering your question, Doug, get out and talk to people, spend time chatting to people that you know and respect, and use the information that you get from your publications to furnish conversations that will help to generate insight.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I mean, it really is so important to create a community in an industry that's famously so closed off. And to your remedy for QR codes, I remember in 2020, everyone thinking they're baffling. Then suddenly they're in the pub to enable, no contamination, and suddenly everyone got them.
Yes,
so maybe that's the secret sauce to getting innovative payment materials into the British public, right?
Yeah, to do it down the pub. Exactly. Yeah. Having conversations in your community. That's exactly right.
There we go. Amazing. Well, Tony, that's all we've got time for. I just want to say a massive thank you for appearing. It's, some of these insights are so fascinating, right at the heart of government and right at the heart of innovations. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And also a massive thank you to you, our viewers. You can catch the rest of the series and so much more over at ffnews.com and of course over at payable.com too. Thank you very much and goodbye.